As you can see from the screen, we will begin in Philippians chapter 2 today. For those of you on Zoom who can't see the screen, we will be in Philippians chapter 2 today. At least that's where we'll get our start. We'll be in the book of John quite a bit today as well. Gospel of John. In Philippians 2, we have a text set aside to prepare our minds to discuss Jesus. The Apostle Paul writing this letter, encouraging the Philippian Christians to be mindful of some things. Regardless of the fact that the Philippian Christians didn't really have any notable correction for the Apostle Paul to write about to them, which is one of the reasons why Philippians is such a nice epistle. It's so relaxing. If you want to have a hard day, read 1 Corinthians, right? But if you want to relax and read the text, you go to Philippians. It's nice and relaxing. And one of the things that he does is he reminds them of some things, which is something that we all need, which is why, by the wisdom of God, we gather weekly, at least once a week together, to be reminded of things that otherwise could slip between the cracks of our life. So let's go ahead and read together. Philippians 2, beginning in verse 5. We will read to verse 8. Beginning in verse 5, it says, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God." That's the King James. Many of their versions will say something like, "Thought it not something to be grasped." Verse 7, "But made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross." These prolific words that the Apostle Paul wrote, I want to take a moment to meditate on them together. First off, I'd like us to notice now that this text does this amazing job of condensing who Jesus is and what he became and for what purpose. Really amazing. This takes the whole idea of the Christ, which encapsulates truly the whole gospel message, which, if you can really condense the gospel message in just a few words, it would be that Jesus died, was buried, and was resurrected. That's one of the ways in which the Apostle Paul condensed the whole gospel message in just a few words. 1 Corinthians. But here we find him writing, but verse 5, he tells the Philippian Christians, and by extension us as well, to let this mindset be within us as well. So whatever this mindset is, it's something that we want to also bring into our own lives, internalize for ourselves, this idea that he's going into. And what he describes is Jesus being in the form of God. That's what he says in verse 6, the form of God. Somebody pointed out to me a neat observation, something that I thought was interesting. Take a look at verse 6. It says, who being in the form of God. So the form of something is what it is. We are in the form of being human. That's what we are. If I were to look at you and ask you, what are you? You'd probably look at me and say, oh, I'm a human. Or describe yourself in some way. It is what you end up becoming. It's what you are, your being. But you're also like things as well. We're like animals in a lot of ways. We all breathe air, or many of us. Some animals breathe water, so we're more like mammals, but we're also like fish of the sea because they have a heartbeat, right? We're like other things. But just because you're like an animal doesn't mean you're an animal. You are the form of a human, but you're like an animal. See? So it's interesting the way the Apostle Paul uses the word form here, but take notice of the fact that he uses another word in verse 7. So we're going to read verse 7. But made himself of no reputation, but took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. So Jesus became like men. He was the form of God, the form of a servant. He became like men. Then verse 8, he continues, and being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself. So what we find, now I'm going to make this condense into just this one simple statement. It'll be something like this. God became man, right? Now, I'm not going to take a whole lot of time to prove that Jesus is God, because all you got to do is read the whole New Testament, and you'll find that for yourself. But God came down from heaven and became man. Now, this right here is something that is really bizarre, but for those of us who have been hearing the gospel so much, who have heard this message, and this message has been around for 2,000 years, right? Because God didn't become man before the Christ. That was a new thing, you know what I mean? That God interacted with man. God sent, his word. He sent angels. Jesus even took certain forms, earlier in the Old Testament. However, God didn't become man until he became born of a woman. That happened at the coming of the Christ. So for us, since we've been hearing that for years and years and years and generations, it can kind of become a type of white noise to us. But to the first century people, this was just weird. It was just bizarre. But when you actually stop and take a few steps back from your life and the fact that you already know this and stop and think about it, how does God become man? How in the world can you take God who created the heavens and the earth and the vastness of who he is, who none of us can even come close to comprehend, and to put that into one human? It's a lot. Really a lot to think about. So what I'm going to do right now, here's for those of you who can see the slides, I have something a little bit different that I'm going to do. My style has been to do nothing but verses, but I actually added a couple of words, and to me it's a lot, to add this. Any kind of change for me is a lot because I don't like change. But watch this. Put a heading over every slide. See that? For those of you on Zoom who can't see it, I have the words perfection experiences imperfection. That's just a combination of words that are my attempt to describe what it is for God to become mankind, God to become humanity. For eternity to experience finite, temporary existence. So perfection comes down from heaven and experiences imperfection. So I have a text there that I want you to read with me. It's John chapter 1. John chapter 1. And within the introductory remarks of John the Beloved, who wrote this gospel, we actually find the major themes of the whole book contained within the first handful of verses. He did a fine job of introducing his work. And what I'd like to do is read verses 15 through 18 with you, where he explains what John the Baptist had witnessed concerning the coming Christ. So, John 1, beginning at verse 15, it says, John bore witness of him, cried, saying, This was he of whom I spoke. He that comes after me is preferred before me, for he was before me. And of his fullness, all we received, grace for grace. For the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. Now, verse 18 is the main verse that I want you to focus on with me right now. No man has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared. That verse 18 tells us a couple of facts, something that we all have to acknowledge for ourselves, that not a single one of us can look at anybody else square in the eye and say, I've been to heaven, I've experienced eternity, and I've seen God face to face. None of us have been able to see God face to face. We've been able to catch glimpses of God. We've been able to catch ideas of who God is through the scriptures, many different ways in which he reveals himself, but none of us can say that we have seen God face to face. There is only one who has that actual right, only one who actually is able to make that claim. That's Jesus the Christ. That is going to be a theme. Now, whenever you in your private time read the book of John, one of the things that you will find, and I honestly will encourage everybody in the next several weeks to go ahead and read through the book of John. It's a very nice read and an easy read even. And notice how one of the themes of the book of John is Jesus basically trying to help everybody understand, I came from heaven, I know what I'm talking about. That really is a big part of what he's trying to do. I'm going to show you another verse now about this idea of perfection having to experience imperfection. Chapter 3, verse 13, just a couple pages over. We're going to read that verse. This is him talking to Nicodemus, and he makes this statement. And no man has ascended up to heaven, but he that came down from heaven. You see how similar it is to the last verse we read? Earlier said, no man has seen God at any time except for Jesus, right? And here we have another statement being said, no man has ascended up to heaven, but he that came down from heaven, even the Son of Man, which is in heaven. Jesus is talking to Nicodemus. Take a look at the context. Look what he says in verse 10. Jesus answered, said to him, are you a master of Israel and know not these things? So Nicodemus is confused by the things that Jesus is saying. And so he asks him that, you're a master or a teacher in Israel, but you don't understand this. And now watch what he says in verse 11. Verily, verily, I say unto you, we speak what we know and testify of what we have seen. You receive not our witness. Jesus says there that the things that we have been able to look upon, the things that we have been able to experience, we have been able to see, that's what we testify. Well, Jesus is testifying of heaven, being the only one who has the right to do that. And he says in verse 12, if I have told you earthly things and you believe not, how shall you believe if I tell you of heavenly things? So it's an amazing theme throughout the whole book of John. One of the ones that I've noticed in my studies of the book of John, Jesus has been given a task of describing to people and having people understand his word on what they need to do in order to get to heaven. And the fact that he's been to heaven, and I'm trying to tell you guys, you want to go with him. How do you explain a beautiful mountain range scene to a blind man? Somebody who's never seen a mountain range, you know what I mean? Is there anybody in this room, maybe it's just something, you don't have to raise your hand, who hasn't had Cajun food? You haven't had Cajun food? Let me tell you what Cajun food is like. There's spices involved. But I can't really explain to you what it's like. You gotta try it yourself. Anybody else have any more descriptive terms on how to describe Cajun food? It's its own experience. Anybody here ever met somebody who thought that sushi was the most disgusting thing they had ever heard of? And then they tried it? When I was growing up, sushi wasn't like the big thing back in the 90s, apparently. And I always put in schools, they would ask you questions like, make an art project about your favorite food and this and that. And I always put sushi. Everyone else put chocolate and ice cream and pizza, right? People looked at me like I was nuts for loving sushi. And people had told me how disgusting it was for years and years and years. And then people started trying it, and people started to realize, hey, it's actually pretty good. But you don't know until you try it. So it's not like I can have a conversation with somebody and describe to them what Cajun food or sushi is like. You just got to try it. Well, guess what? None of us can just try heaven. So we have to take the word of somebody. That's Jesus. And that's like this whole idea about like perfection coming down. So basically what happened is, in order for mankind to really be able to experience perfection, perfection had to come down. Tell us about it. That's part of the message. That's part of what Jesus came here to do. To literally tell us, I came from heaven. I actually am God. Now I need you to listen to me because I'm just trying to get you there. And then mankind starts rejecting him and being all doubtful. But if I tell you right now, trust me, you'll love sushi. Most of you ain't going to trust me. There's skepticism. There's a doubt involved with it. Humans are doubtful people. So one of the things that Jesus had to do was he actually came down here to experience imperfection on our behalf. Take a look at Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 8. Hebrews 5 and verse 8. Now, this is where the message and the first point that we're talking about, perfection, experiencing imperfection, is interesting because what we've been talking about, honestly, is the fact that we who represent imperfection can't really experience perfection. Not yet. We just have to take perfection's word for it. But what happened is Jesus came down and he did the opposite of that. He, as perfection, experienced imperfection. Hebrews 5:8 says, though he were a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. You know, it's a really bizarre thing, and it's paradoxical. I was using that word last week in my lesson because a paradox is something that is true, and the opposite is also true at the exact same time. It's really interesting because Jesus knew everything, did he not? God who created all things knew everything. His infinite knowledge, his knowledge was infinite. But you know what's really interesting? At the same time, God did not know everything. He did not know what it was like to be man until Jesus came down from heaven and experienced imperfection. What that did, in a certain sense, is it created God's capacity for knowledge, God's actual infinite understanding. Go back to that Cajun idea. I can imagine what Cajun food is like. I can look at somebody else while they're eating it. I can look at the colors of the food and I can think I know what it is, but I'm never really going to know what it's like till I try it. I could even be a chef, have the recipe, put all the spices in the recipe, and still never even really try it. And what's really odd and interesting is that's actually what position God was in. God created all of us. He knew every nook and cranny, every detail about us. But he didn't know what it was like to be us. What happened was Jesus came down and experienced imperfection with us. Still in the book of Hebrews, go back just a couple of pages. Take a look at chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 17 and 18. Wherefore in all things it behoved him to be made like unto his brethren, that he might be a merciful, faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make reconciliation for the sins of other people. That's wild. Make reconciliation for the sins of the people. And verse 18 says, for in that he himself has suffered, being tempted, he is able to help them that are tempted. He is able to help them. He is able to aid them that are tempted. Once again, we have this idea about perfection coming down and having to experience imperfection. I don't know what heaven is like, personally. I can only imagine. What I imagine Jesus left was something pretty sweet. Okay. I can read about heaven, get little glimpses of it. Like there's one major idea. We have a song about it. No tears in heaven. No tears in heaven. Now that represents there's no sorrow, there's no pain in heaven. Jesus gets the respect that he deserves in heaven. Stop and think about that for a second. That means he's glorified all day, every day in heaven. What's he get down here? What's he get in this existence? I promise you, this past week, I spent hours not respecting Jesus the way I should have. If I spent every second of my day doing nothing but worshiping him, it still wouldn't be enough. So if his own people don't even know how to respect, think about what's happening in the world around us as well. You don't get nothing down here. I use this example all the time. Go to the national parks. Drive along the national parks and look at all these signs that glorify God's creation. How much credit does God get in all these signs? Zero. They never mention the one who created it all. But in heaven, he is glorified. No tears in heaven. And then he left that and came down here. Now, he left that and came down here, did he not? And then he wore the best clothes and ate the finest foods and had servants all around him feeding him grapes. Not even in the slightest. He was butchered. In fact, what he did was he went ahead and said, you know, I'm going to go ahead and experience these temptations because so I can actually know and experience what my people have been through. Because in the past, regardless of how true this statement might be, in the past, humanity could look at God and say, God, you don't know what it's like to be us. Even though it's still ridiculous, it was also true. God didn't know what it was like to be humanity. I actually had to learn this lesson a time or two in my life. I've had actual experiences and memories and interactions with people. I would look at them like in the eye and say, yo, dude, get over it. With whatever the sin or the temptation or the pain may have been in their life. I used to look at humanity and say, what is wrong with humanity? And then one day I started to realize that I was also as imperfected as the rest of them. When I started to go through some of my own pain and my own issues, I started to realize that mankind is fragile. So the God of heaven actually came down and he hung on a cross. And now he can look at us and he can say, no, trust me, I know what it's like. Trust me, I know what pain is. And it actually says that he did that so that he could aid us and that he could help us. So, perfection had to experience imperfection. And as a result of that, as we have been talking about this interesting idea, what then happened was perfection then also had to do something with that experience. So I'm going to show you the next little thing here. Perfection oops, I'm behind. There we go. Perfection becomes mingled with imperfection. Go with me to John chapter 2. So, I told you a moment ago we'd be in the book of John. We spent a little bit of time here. So, when we were in chapter 1, it pointed out that no one has seen God except for he who has actually seen God, which is Christ. Now take a look at John chapter 2, 23 through 25. It says, now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover, talking about Jesus, in the feast day, many believed in his name when they saw the miracles which he did. But Jesus did not commit himself unto them, because he knew all men, and needed not that any should testify of man, for he knew what was in man. What would be a really interesting thought experiment? A real interesting thought experiment would be if we could actually go through an organized period of time where everybody had to actually share their innermost thoughts and details and everything that came across their mind. We would probably, humanity, honestly, let's say we had an experiment where all humans knew what all the humans were thinking all the time, like just every thought. Every time you looked at somebody, they did something you didn't like, and you just told them what you didn't like and why you didn't like it, and why what they did was the most ridiculous thing you've ever seen. And by the way, you're disgusting. You disgust me. You know, I like those kinds of thoughts and those kinds of emotions. My guess is within a month, mankind would be extinct. It wouldn't make it that long. Now, imagine being Jesus, having to be engaged with other people and always knowing what's going on in their heart, knowing what's going on in their mind. Jesus' response, he was probably tempted to wipe us out often. You know what I mean? He was probably tempted to just go ahead. I don't know how to deal with these people anymore. I'm going insane just knowing their thoughts, because they're all insane also. But this text is really, really interesting to me, and it's something that causes me to think a little bit, because it just simply says that Jesus did not commit himself to the people around him. You know, last week, I preached a lesson on how we have to make sure that our faith is in the God of heaven and the God of heaven alone. But you cannot count on the faith of anybody else. You cannot count on anybody else, truly. I mean, I might be able to trust you to, help me out. If I'm going to move or something, I can, trust somebody here to show up and help me deliver a couple of boxes to a new house or something like that. But I can't count on you for many things truly in life. Now Jesus is in a position where he is truly alone. He actually knows what it's like to be lonely. And so when he's looking at the people all around him, he simply just kind of has to put a little barrier between him and everybody else, not fully commit himself to those around him. Because by doing so, things would go wrong. But that experience doesn't change the fact that he's still willing to do everything for humanity. So the reason I'm going into this is to help us understand and think about the fact that earlier we were talking about perfection, experiencing imperfection, and what he did was he actually went through all the pain and sorrow with humanity. Simultaneously, Jesus had to learn how to coexist with humanity and not let it contaminate. He had to know how to interact with the apostles. He had to know how to interact with the Pharisees if they're angry. He had to know how to interact with them in their doubts and their questions and all the corruption of these other humans and not let it contaminate him. So what Jesus did was he kept himself mingled with humanity, but he never did really commit himself to humanity. But this is one thing that he did do, and it's something that gives us, John 15 and verse 1, this is something that gives us a complete idea of what we were just talking about, of a certain balance. Even though Jesus wouldn't commit himself to humanity because he knew what was in man, it didn't keep him from loving humanity. John 13 and verse 1 says, "Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, he should depart out of this world unto the Father. Having loved his own, which were in the world, he loved them unto the end." That verse just contains a certain beauty to it. Because Jesus, even though he didn't commit himself according to the text in John chapter 2, he still had a commitment of love to his people. And that lasted up until the very end. So, the purpose for perfection having to be mingled with imperfection and experiencing imperfection was that perfection may perfect the imperfected. So I'm going to show you John chapter 10, verses 10 and 11. John 10, verses 10 and 11. This is going back a couple of pages. Jesus talking about the parable of the Good Shepherd says, "The thief came not but for to steal and to kill and to destroy. I am come that they might have life, that they might have it more abundantly. I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd gives life for the sheep." And we are now in the phase of this lesson where, after talking about some of these interesting ideas about Jesus and how someone so perfect is able to experience and be connected with we who are imperfect, even though we are totally incompatible. The complete idea is that Jesus, as God, comes down in the flesh and gives his life so that we might have life everlasting. So now that Jesus was able to use a certain power that he had, that only he had, to make that which is imperfect perfect somehow. But what that does is it puts us in a new position, puts us in a different position. Our goal is to have life. Our goal is to respond to the gospel call. Now, many of us in this room have responded to that gospel call. If you haven't responded to that gospel call, there will be an opportunity to do so at the end of the lesson. But as a result of us responding to the gospel call, we're now placed in an interesting position. And it's a position that is interesting because we are able to do something by divine design that God and Jesus want us to do. But it's not an easy task. We are hereby required to continue to coexist with everyone around us who is imperfect, just like Jesus did. But we have a little something different that not even Jesus had. You know that there is actually one thing that Jesus did not actually have to go through. Something that Jesus didn't actually experience. You know the one thing Jesus will never actually be able to experience? Actual guilt. Actual realization of the fact that he needs salvation and he needs God in that way. But everyone in this room has an ability with humility to look at other people in the eye and say, trust me, I thought I had it figured out too. I thought I knew. I thought I was a good person too. Until I realized who God is. And what we end up finding ourselves in is we should be in a position to, with joy and energy and excitement, help other people understand and realize that I am imperfectly. And that's actually like the main takeaway and thing that I want to leave you with today. Because the whole first section of the lesson was all about Jesus and what he did. That's actually characteristic of a lot of the epistles, a lot of the writings that we find in the Bible. You know, a lot of the writings of the New Testament of the Bible is mostly about who God is and what God has done for humanity. And that's what we dedicated the first part of the lesson to. But now what we are able to address for the last little piece of the lesson right now, we're able to stop and think about all these things that Jesus did, the impossible, all this impossible stuff that he did in order to bring us life. And now we are put in a position to where we now need to make a decision on what we do about it. Everything that Jesus did, we also have to do, but it's in a different way. Jesus experienced this life, what we are experiencing this life right now. We experienced life without God. Jesus had to learn how to mingle himself with the people around him. We also have to mingle ourselves with the people around us and learn what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. A lot of Christians want to look like everyone else in the world. That's like the opposite of what Jesus did. So, now that Jesus did all of that, our mission is to figure out what we can do because of what he did for us. So I'm going to take you now to one last text, and it's found in Galatians chapter 2. So Galatians chapter 2 is going to be the full circle of the lesson, which started with Philippians, because we started in Philippians. And I'll refresh your memory on what Philippians chapter 2 was about. Verse 5, he says, or actually verses 6 through 8. Verses 6 through 8 of Philippians 2, afterwards simply says that Jesus took the form of a man, even though he was God, but he took the likeness of man, and then he became obedient to the cross, obedient unto death. But verse 5, the way the text began was with this statement. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. So, our text in Galatians is going to be connecting all the stuff that Jesus did, bringing it into the application of let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. Galatians 2 and verse 14. The context is about Jews who thought that they were superior, trying to enforce the law of Moses on the Gentiles. The Apostle Paul addresses this issue very clearly and very seriously. And we're going to read it together now, beginning in verse 14. It says, when I saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter before them all, if you, being a Jew, live after the manner of Gentiles, and not as do the Jews, why do you compel the Gentiles to live as the Jews? So you see, first off here, that Paul is helping Peter understand he had to stand him to the face and address him for the fact that Peter actually separated himself from other Christians, not even people of the world, just other Christians, because of their background. Because they had a different way or different style of thinking. So just because of that and this cultural difference, even Peter, who was one of the pillars of the faith, as he was described earlier in the epistle, was carried away with a type of hypocrisy. And it is very difficult for Christians to learn how to be mingled one with another sometimes. But it doesn't happen if we don't think about it. It doesn't happen properly if we don't put the time and the energy into how we ought to be one with another. There's not a single one of us who knows how to behave properly without proper instruction. So we should be putting time and energy into this. Even Peter himself was carried away with hypocrisy. Does that not mean that many of us are going to be tempted to do something very similar? Moving on to the text, verse 15. It says, we who are Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles know that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ. Even we have believed in Jesus Christ that we might be justified by the faith of Christ, and not by the works of the law, for by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. Verse 17. But if, while we seek to be justified by Christ, we ourselves also are found sinners. Is therefore Christ the minister of sin? God forbid. Really interesting message. Verse 16, helping us to understand and realize that our salvation is by the Christ, and not because you have done so well. Then he continues, as he writes, to instruct in the form of a question. Christ is not the minister of sin. Just because the world continues on this kind of path, and many of us struggle with these things, we ought not to continue in as well. Verse 18, for if I build again the things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. For I to the law, I'm dead to the law, that I might live in the God. Now the last verse, verse 20. I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. Yet not I, but Christ lives in me. Life which I now live in the flesh, live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me, gave himself for me. Now we give our lives over to Jesus, and by doing so, imperfection becomes perfected. So if there's anybody here who has not been able to make this commitment, come and be baptized